Could you all please take your seats? Oh, they're leaving. So, for the second half of the program, our next poet is Tom DeGidio, who was part of the Suppose and I's poetry group at the University of Pennsylvania's Kelly Writers House, and he's a director at large of the New York Browning Society. Thank you for being a director at large. We've served together on the New York Browning Society, and I greatly appreciate you.
Thank you.
Harlem's undergroundbooks.org publishes Tom's chapbook, The Enigma of Arrival, and he will present his translations of contemporary Roman poet Valerio Magrelli. Please welcome Tom DeGidio.
Okay, which microphone do I speak into?
The one where I can hear Tom.
That remains to be heard. Okay. I actually wrote is this working? I actually wrote a little talk. It's called Trials and Temptations of a Translator. And I guess I got the alliteration thing going okay. And I'm going to translate Valerio Magrelli. I bought this book 10 years ago, or 11 years ago when it came out. He's a now 64-year-old Roman poet. I remember when he was a kid. And like many of us kids, we grow up, if we're lucky. And this is the major English. This has selections from several of his collections, so it's a good. The only problem with it is it's translated by a pretty good translator who happens to be an Englishman. So there are things that actually to the American ear sound a little weird, but because, you know, he probably went to like Eton or something like that. So anyway, here we go. Trials and Temptations of a Translator. I'm going to translate Valerio Magrelli. And I don't know whether to put on more of an Italian accent or not. It might make it actually harder to understand. But Valerio Magrelli, a contemporary Roman poet who has the appropriately Roman name of Valerio, which in ancient Rome was Valerius. And are there people named Valerio in Romania? Yeah, of course. And the appropriately Roman name of Valerio, which has retained its popularity since ancient times, including in Romania. Since ancient times when there were many famous and indeed valorous Valeriuses, including at least 5 poets, not all of whose poetry has survived, unfortunately. English cognates include both valor and valuable. Quite the opposite is his last name, Magrelli, which immediately reminds an Italian of the word magro, or thin. Magrelli is furthermore a diminutive, suggestive of ancestors who were not only thin, but also small. An English cognate is meager. Meager is actually related to this name. Fortunately for Valerio Magrelli, it's okay for poets to have both strengths and weaknesses. And now for a poem by Valerio Magrelli. I'm going to read just a couple of lines in Italian, not the whole poem, just to give you a little bit of a flavor. And he's generally speaking a fairly intellectual poet, although the last poem I'm going to translate is a love poem, and that's rather different. So this first poem begins, ho spesso immaginato che gli sguardi sopravvivono all'atto del vedere. And that means, I've often imagined that glances outlive the act of looking, as if they were arrows with measurable trajectories or lances hurled in a battle. Then I think that in the room I just left, lines of this kind must remain for some time suspended, crisscrossed, holding their positions as in a game of pickup sticks. This very last line in this poem bothered me, because pickup sticks is an old-fashioned game with which newer generations are probably not familiar. They're playing video games. They never even heard of pickup sticks. But it also intrigued me because the Italian for pickup sticks is legni dello Shanghai, or Shanghai sticks. I looked up the history of the game and found out that it was first marketed in 19th century Germany, and suddenly everything clicked. I knew from the biography of Hermann Hesse that Lutheran missionaries, such as his father and grandfather, had spent time in China, bringing back a knowledge of the I Ching and its method of divination through the tossing of yarrow stalks, so that I was sorely tempted to rewrite the last line to say, like the augury to be had from the throwing of the yarrow stalks. That's somewhat like the liberties Robert Lowell allowed himself in his fascinating, if controversial, collection of translations called imitations, since he didn't dare call them translations. But then, further, in my mind's eye, I began to see Magrelli's poem as describing the hallucinatory party scene in Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf, and decided to drop the whole thing. Next, I translated a Magrelli poem that begins with two quotes some of you may recognize. Quote 1, "And the crack in the teacup opens a lane to the land of the dead." That's W.H. Auden. And then a further quote at the head of his poem, quote, "As when a crack appears the length of a cup." That's Rilke. And then the poem proper begins. "I receive from you this red cup with which to toast my days one by one, a string of pale mornings, pearls making a long necklace of thirst. And should it fall and break, I, full of compassion, will see to its repair, that my kisses may proceed uninterrupted. And every time that the handle or rim cracks, I'll keep fixing it with glue until my love has slowly accomplished the making of a durable mosaic. Down along the curve of the cup's white interior, the black crack descends with the zig and the zag of a lightning bolt, sign of a storm that keeps on thundering around in this landscape of enamel. The prominent ending of this poem on the word enamel, which in Italian is smalto, reminded me of the unusual use of this word, twice that I know of, by Dante in his Inferno. In the fourth canto, Dante takes his place alongside the ancient poets Homer, Horace, Ovid, and Lucan, Dante being no wallflower, who are standing on grass that Dante then realizes is in fact a hard surface of green enamel, or as Dante says, smalto. Then in the ninth canto, Dante is threatened by the Furies, who say they're going to get Mendoza to turn him into what most translations give as stone. But again, Dante uses this term smalto, or enamel, perhaps appropriate to hell because it is fused through great heat. And then also there's the monster, the sinuous lizard-like monster of Canto 25, which as it zigs and zags across Dante's path, reminds him of a jagged bolt of lightning. So Auden, Rilke, and maybe Dante are part of this poem. Dante is, after all, the poet most likely lurking in the background of an Italian poem, as for that matter in the poems of such Americans as Pound and Eliot. And so maybe the cup is a sort of infernal landscape of damage and danger, perhaps of punishment for kisses, like Paolo and Francesca. The satanically red cup, a scary, stormy terrain, a circular pit through which one travels as along one of the Malebolgiae, as Dante called them, the perilous pits of hell. Poems are often made from other poems. But a teacup from hell, I don't know. For good reason, the Italians have a saying, traduttore, traditore, or translator, traitor. How can you make sure that all the cultural information gets into your translation? Like the TARDIS in Doctor Who, the inside of the poem is much larger than the outside. When Magrelli was a mere 22 years old, he was included in a big international poetry festival held on a beach near Rome in the summer of 1979. I was at that festival, and by big, I mean huge, with famous poets from many countries, and an audience for 3 days running of 20,000 people each day. I sometimes refer to it as the Woodstock of poetry festivals. Magrelli's inclusion in the festival didn't mean that he was regarded as an important poet. He was one of a number of young Roman poets who got to read a poem apiece because they were Romans. And the festival was put on by the city of Rome. His appearance made no particular impression. And in fact, I far better remember the readings by some other young Romans like Roberto Manacorda and Antonella Anedda. Then, just a few months later, in 1980, Magrelli's first collection appeared, and it was declared the most important first collection in Italian poetry since the appearance of Eugenio Montale's Ossi di Sepia, Cuttlefish Bones, in 1928. So this guy went from almost total obscurity to being declared essentially the greatest Italian poet, then writing at age 23. Who would have believed that a poetry collection with an obscure title to boot, in Latin no less, would attract so much attention? That collection is called, in Latin, Ora Serata Retinae. And the exact meaning was a puzzle to me, even though I studied Latin in school, because as I eventually discovered, it's a scientific term for a bit of tissue connecting the retina with the optic nerve, and literally means serrated edge of the retina. And that in itself, I think, took a lot of nerve for like an unknown poet to give his first collection a title like that. I mean, you would go in the bookstore and say, like, what is that, However, high praise for that collection came immediately from such luminaries as Mexico's Octavio Paz and the exiled Russian Joseph Brodsky, who did not give out compliments lightly, I can tell you. Here's my translation of the first poem of Magrelli's first landmark collection. And he kind of begins at the beginning, so to speak. I don't have a glass of water by my bed. I have this notebook. Sometimes I write down words in the dark, and the next day finds them stunned by the light, with nothing to say. They're night things, set out to dry, that curl under the sun's rays and even explode with a little pop, leaving a scattering of fragments, the broken shards of sleep that overwhelm the page. I managed to gather only a cemetery of thoughts in my hands. And in conclusion, I will read, without further commentary, a love poem of sorts from Magrelli's third collection called Esercizi di Tiptologia, or Tiptological Exercises, published in 1992. Perhaps with more age, he developed his emotional side a little more. It's called The Embrace, L'Abbraccio. And this one I think I should probably read in Italian and English. If I can find it here. I'll read the English first. As you sleep next to me, I bend my body, and moving close to you, draw sleep from your face like a wick draws flame from another wick, and the two votive lights are there, the flame catching as sleep flows between us. But as it catches, the furnace in the cellar rumbles. Down there, the ooze of fossils burns. way down there, prehistory glows hot. Dead, submerged, fermented peats surge up into my radiator. In a dark halo of petroleum, the bedroom is a nest heated by organic deposits, compost heaps, swamp gas, and we, 2 wicks, are the 2 tongues of that single Paleozoic torch. And I'm going to read that. I'm going to read that in Italian because just to give you one complete poem in Italian. Let's see, where is it? Here we are. 132. Okay. Tu dormi accanto a me, così io mi inchino e accostato al tuo viso prendo sonno, come fa lo stoppino, da un stoppino che gli passa il fuoco. E i 2 lumini stanno mentre la fiamma passa e il sonno fila. Ma mentre fila, vibra la caldaia nelle cantine. Laggiù si brucia una natura fossile. Là in fondo arde la preistoria, morte, torbe, sommerse, fermentate, avvampano nel mio termosifone. In una buia aureola di petrolio, la cameretta è un nido riscaldato da depositi organici, da roghi, da liquami, e noi stoppini siamo le 2 lingue di quell'unica torcia paleozoico. Thank you. Valerio Magrelli, everybody.
Thank you, Tom. So our last speaker, Robert Kramer, is the Emeritus Director of International Studies at Manhattan College, and he's a current Vice President of the New York Browning Society. His latest collection is At the Margins, Al Margen, published by Darklight, Mexico City and New York City. His presentation will reflect the extensive translations he has made from every period of German poetry. So please welcome Dr. Robert Kramer.
I'd like to take you on a brief tour through the byways of German literature in the form of my feeble translations. And I'd like to begin with 2 poems from my second favorite city in one of its most glorious periods. This is Vienna in the 1890s and the turn of the century. I'd like to begin with a poem by a poet named Richard Schaukel, who probably nobody here has ever heard of, but I think he's worthy of hearing. His poem in the original German is titled Angst, and so I've cleverly titled it in English, Angst. This poem, some people have called it a predecessor of T.S. Eliot's Love Song of Alfred Prufrock, but 15 years earlier. This is Angst by Richard von Schaukel. In my white cravat, my white high vest, precisely parted hair, and gloves on my hands, I've fled again the silence, again have drunk and laughed and chatted, looked for love in lovely eyes, and cursed myself and all my masks. More and more estranged from myself, I've played a role with moods and feelings. In phrases elegant and witty, I've discussed my psychic murder, cheated myself of any style, and when most honest, I have lied. A trembling, pale, great fear infects me, which I parry all in vain. What troubles me, I diagnose as but exhausted nerves, in vain. It is the fear of time's swift flight that whips me on, not boredom's lash. The hours pass along beside me with rattling steps. Indeed, I'm shocked by the harmless gliding pendulum. The ticking of the clock torments me, for I feel the hours as they pass, gazing at me, mute and scornful. I'd like to read another poem from the Vienna of that period. This, of course, is a time when Mahler was composing, Schoenberg, Webern was coming along. In the visual arts, we had Klimt and Schiele and Kokoschka. In design, we had the Wiener Werkstätte. In so many fields, for example, a guy named Sigmund Freud was beginning to make a name for himself. And Ernst Mach, the great physicist, was also the most influential philosopher among the new poets in Vienna of the 90s. So here's a poem, again by a poet who you've never heard of, who became a distinguished diplomat. And it's called, There Are Feelings That We Cannot Grasp. There are feelings that we cannot grasp that flow through us like withered flowers' fragrance, for which we mourn when softly they elude us, like the kisses of a woman long since dead, and dreams that flee as soon as we awaken, that yet lie trembling in our waking soul, foreboding of a sorrow not yet felt, which we perhaps tomorrow shall endure. And there are pictures of lovely, sinful women lost in dead time's fascination, and on their lips, around their brow, the smile they've chosen for themselves. And from such scenes, life's unexplained, mysterious sorrows drift upon us. For one brief moment rest, as we behold the lipstick's bloody kisses upon that white and swelling breast. This is something kind of interesting about Andrian. He has poetry relating to pornography, pornographic pictures. And I know of no other poet of that period or before that who explored the area, the world of pornography. And now I'd like to read a woman poet from the same period, but from Germany, a woman named Hedwig Lachmann. Are any of you familiar with Mike Nichols, the director and comedian? And this is Mike Nichols' grandmother. Mike Nichols was German, and his family fled Germany when the Nazis came in. So this is Grandma writing now, and I think she's quite distinctive in her own right. It's called In the Course of Life by Hedwig Lachmann. I often think how gray my hair has grown. Are my cheeks still fresh and blooming as they once were? As when a hiker stops and looks back, and then he says to himself, how far I've gone. Then, still more ardently, my feelings surge to the today that's not yet floated away. And what I lived through so painfully before, now from the past, how coolly it emerges. Like a friend whom you've lost, perhaps, and whom by chance you come across years later, and even as you both extend your hands with questioning lips, you do not tell of all you've undergone. Your eyes, of course, will nod in friendly greeting from lowered eyelids, so as if with pity. But your heart speaks imperceptibly. Is that you? And feels so alien and knows nothing more to say. Hedwig Schlachmann. I'd like to read another German woman poet from the period, Else Lasker-Schüler, who has been called the greatest German woman poet. I have a favorite among her works, a little erotic poem, which is called Little Syrinx Song. You might know Syrinx was the beloved of the god Pan. So this is Elsa with an interesting proposal. Little Syrinx Song. The palm leaves dart like tongues of vipers into the cups of the red gladiolas, and the moon sickle laughs as furtive as the eye of the fawn. The world holds life embraced in the rays of Saturn, and through the dreaming of the night it flashes purple. Now let us bind ourselves together with rushes in the cane reed thicket, and in the red dawn's early glow, let us fathom the south of our love. And another woman poet from the period, her writer's name was Carmen Silva, but she happened to be the Queen of Romania, formerly Princess Elizabeth of Wied. Very brief conversation, very brief poem, describing the typical conversation when the high and the mighty get together. What do they talk about? It's very brief conversation. Who was the fairest at the ball? Whose lovely wife has come to a fall? The finest horse in whose fine stall? The biggest fortune in whose great hall? Those just asleep now, listen, all. That's the Queen of Romania. And I'd like to read the last poem of Friedrich Nietzsche, the great philosopher, who was a gifted poet. This is from 1889, before the madness caused by his syphilis swept him away. This is called Venice. Venice. On the bridge I stood one brown and recent night, and from afar came song. Golden droplets gushed across the water's trembling surface. Gondolas, lanterns, music. Drunken floating out into the twilight, my soul, become a lute, was touched by unseen fingers and sang in secret a gondolier's refrain, trembling with dappled joy. Did anyone out there hear it? And I'd like to go back now to the mid-19th century. A poem by Gottfried Keller, the greatest Swiss novelist, which might not sound impressive, but which is really quite magnificent. This is a poem called Winter Night. It's an experience or a vision of a winter night. Not a wing beat flashed in all that world. Still and dazzling lay the moon-white snow. Not a cloud across the firmament nor wave astir in frozen lake below. From its depths had risen a sunken tree until its branches froze within the ice. And in those branches climbed the water nymph, and through the blue-green ice she peered at me. Upon the thin, transparent glass I stood that separated darkened depths from me. Hovering close beneath my feet, I glimpsed her lovely limbs so white and fair to see. With strangled grief she groped and scratched against the hardened cover that confined. Her darkened face, I never shall forget. Forever it shall stare within my mind. Now this is the version that he published, but the earlier version is quite different in the last stanza. The earlier version, which he suppressed, did not publish at first, is this. With strangled grief she groped and scratched against the hardened cover that confined. Her darkened face, I'm sorry, let me do that again. With strangled grief she groped and scratched against the hardened cover that confined. A feeling shuddered through me, fearful, raw, as if it were my own dark soul I saw. So that was the original version, which he suppressed, perhaps because it revealed too much about what he was feeling and thinking. And let's go to the Romantic period now. This is a poem by Joseph von Eichendorff called Yearning, which is like one of the essential emotions of the Romantic movement. It's an interesting poem because it portrays a woman at the window, looking out, listening to the sounds of a summer night, and she hears someone singing. But the strange thing is that the unknown singer, the song, is about a woman at the window on the summer night, listening. This is called Yearning by Joseph von Eichendorff. The stars were shining so golden. Alone at the window I stood and heard afar a carriage, a horn, from the quiet countryside. My heart caught fire within me. Then I thought to myself in secret, oh, happy is he who can journey through the radiant summer night. Two young journeymen passed along the mountain slope. I heard them sing as they walked through the quiet countryside, of dizzying rocky gorges where the forests rustle so softly, of streams that plunge from the cliffs into the forest night. They sang of marble statues, of gardens growing wild through the stones in twilight bowers, of palaces in the moonlight, where girls at the window listen when the sound of the lute awakens and the drowsy fountains murmur in the radiant summer night. And let me go to an earlier period now, the middle 18th century, the period of the 7 Years' War. This is a poem by Anna Louisa Karsh. It was a poor peasant woman, uneducated. She made her own way in the world. She was married, had children, but it was not a pleasant way. But finally she was recognized and invited to the court of Frederick the Great. And finally, in her age and maturity, she was celebrated, rising up from the poverty and misery of her earlier existence. So this is called Confession by Anna Louisa Karsh, born 1722. My days of youth were ever crushed with sorrows. On many a summer morning, my simple soul would sing its stammering song and sighs and sobs. But those sad songs were not for some young man, but to the God who looks upon mankind as one would gaze on a heap of crawling ants. Without affection, of which I have often written, without tenderness, I became a wife, became a mother, as in savage war a maiden was compelled, though not in love, when a soldier half had forced and kissed, and then one who'd climbed the wall that rings our city. What we must wish for fervently and long, and what we know not how to find and hold, it will force itself still deeper in our hearts. The healthy man may squander the juice of the vine, but how refreshing to the sick one's lips will taste, and even in dream, the undrunk wine. And now, I guess in conclusion, I'd like to go to the Baroque age. And what I'd like to read you are some poetic epitaphs. Now, you know what an epitaph is, an inscription on a grave. But the ancient Greeks already turned that into a literary form. So they wrote epitaphs for imaginary people or historical figures or whatever. But these epitaphs were not intended to make you mourn or weep. In fact, they're not particularly PC. Well, you'll see. You know what a cuckold is, right? Do you know the sign of the cuckold? Horns? Okay. This is the epitaph of a cuckold. 2 horns lie buried here. Oh, by the way, I should tell you the poet here. One of my favorite dirty poets is Hofmann from Hofmannswaldau, that unforgettable name, writing this in the mid-17th century. The epitaph of a cuckold. 2 horns lie buried here beneath this solemn stone, but do not think a goat can call this grave his own. Here rests a pious man who got his decoration when he no more could but as fit his wedded station. Okay. And now we have the epitaph of a widow. I was a lovely ship with no one there to load me. It tortured me at night. By day it did corrode me. The light here is not enough to understand me clearly. Since I had lost my mast, I ran aground severely. Let's see. Oh, here's one. The epitaph of a dissipated gentleman. I need a little footnote here because Wien is the German word for Vienna. When I say Wien, it's Vienna. So this is the life experience of a dissipated gentleman. The epitaph of a dissipated gentleman. My liver stayed in Wien, in Rome my manly part. I lost my head in love, in battle I lost heart. And so that I might not lose all my flesh and bone, they lay the rest of me beneath this heavy stone. Let's see. Oh, here's one that's quite offensive. So I have a couple of those. The epitaph of a dog. I used to make my bed upon my mistress' breast. My tiny tongue, her sponge, her stream I liked the best. Now if you promise not to laugh in my poor face, I leave to you alone my favorite resting place. I'll just read 2 more then. This is the epitaph of a fly. I need a footnote here because it refers to Domitian. Domitian is a Roman emperor who is famed for persecuting Christians. The epitaph of a fly. A glass of buttermilk was where my life was lost. A female belly's now the grave where I've been tossed. Be not Domitian, friend, grant in the grave some peace, and close the door that soon the downpour here might cease. And I'll conclude with the epitaph of Messalina, famous historical figure, the dissolute wife of the Emperor Claudius. The epitaph of Messalina. With lust my wanton womb has ever been bedewed. No sport too long, too great, no pleasure I pursued. Lascivious Rome but laughed at all the things I tried. I sometimes was fatigued, but never satisfied. Thank you. And I hope you might not be too fatigued, but might be somewhat satisfied. Thank you. Thank you.